At the time that the Xbox was released, Microsoft was embroiled in monopoly lawsuits. And many people were worried that they would monopolize the games industry, and to an extent they did. But here's the thing, even though it was morally dubious that Microsoft would venture into this game, at the end of the day, Microsoft was a software and hardware company. They were a tech company. The ways in which they were evil were the ways in which many businesses worldwide are evil. It's just the way that Netflix is evil, or Disney, or Apple. They all crave money, and they're all going to do what makes them money. There's nothing really wrong with that desire. But Google comes with a set of moral problems all its own, and ones that we need to grapple with much more specifically. First off, if we're going to move into the cloud, we need to ask what that means for the history of games preservation. If we don't have physical copies of games, that means that we are beholden to their digital libraries and to their digital librarians. And at this point, I can just ask you a simple question. Would you trust Google with art history? Now, I'm not trying to suggest that we're going to live in some sort of post-censorship hellhole. I don't think that's really the case. And, in optimistic news, the internet has actually been a very positive force for games preservation. Think of how many games have gotten re-examined or rescued from anonymity, from online fan bases. I'm not worried about a completely digital video game industry in a vacuum, but I am worried about the caretakers of that industry and what they may do, especially if those caretakers have a vested interest in the product. You need look no further than the yanking of PT from game servers to see how games history could potentially be affected if gamers are not left in control of what they play. And that's to say nothing of a world where Google tries to innovate some sort of gaming streaming service. Because streaming services tend to bottleneck content, and they tend to push other content to the fringes. If everyone's on Netflix, they're going to watch what Netflix has available. They're not going to spend extra money to watch something Netflix doesn't offer. That puts Netflix in a strange position where they actually can control huge swaths of the national discourse. The same is true of games, if streaming is in their future. And all I have to say to that is, how do you feel about Google controlling your Netflix library? How do we feel about Google controlling any of this? And this is where things have to take a little bit of a darker turn. Remember up front where I mentioned that Microsoft, at the end of the day, was a tech company. They sold software and hardware to people. That's what they did. They were a business. Google was also a tech company, but they have a very different business model. You see, Google is much closer to a think tank, and they do a lot of work with the government, and they do a lot of work with other governments, and they do a lot of work with the military. I'm not sure what this means, but imagine a future where kids are playing games like Call of Duty on a console manufactured by the military-industrial complex. I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that reeks of a sort of Kojima-esque irony. And that's why we have to consider our own culpability in the Stadia and its success. Unfortunately, this isn't as simple of a question as, do you want streaming games? It's also not as simple of a question as, do you support Xbox, PlayStation, or Nintendo? To some extent, those questions are benign in comparison to the bigger, looming shadow over the Stadia. The real question here is, what are you morally permitting by purchasing and investing in this console? I'll leave you with this one last thought. Google is currently constructing a search engine for the Chinese government. This search engine is going to operate much the same way Google does, with one exception. You can censor it. I don't bring this up to trash Google, although I don't think they catch nearly enough flack for what they're doing. But I do bring this up because you need to understand, this is the company that wants to play with you in your living room. this is the company that wants you to smile at them. I'm not sure there's an easy answer as to what moral responsibility we have in the Stadia's growth. All I know is that as the console becomes more popular and continues to grow, that moral responsibility is going to feel more and more and more problematic.